Hello, everyone that is there and listening. Let's go ahead and get on with another lecture. And this time we'll be talking about partial payments. And this will be the first part of the lecture, but this will definitely be the bulk of it. The second part will be pretty quick, just kind of a little extra on partial payments for that second part. But this first part will be pretty much everything that we'll need to know. Let's go ahead and get into it. So this first definition here for this date of maturity, this is something we've seen, but we've never really just assigned a name to it. So if you take out a loan, you'll end up borrowing a certain amount of money. That amount of money would be the principal, and then over the course of that loan, interest is going to accrue. And if you add those together, that gives you the future value of that loan. So that future value is just how much you have to pay back when it's all said and done. You know, if you borrow $1,000 from a bank, they're going to charge you some interest in addition to that. So not only do you have to pay the $1,000 principal that you borrowed, but you have to borrow some interest according to however they calculate that interest, whether it be compound interest or simple interest. And so that future value is that full amount that you have to pay. What we say is that there's probably some date that you have to pay that loan by. You have to pay back, they don't just let you pay it back whenever you want. The day that you have to pay that loan back, that is called the date of maturity. And so that's just a term that we'll use just in problems. We'll say, hey, find the date of maturity, or the date of maturity is, April 23rd, or whatever date it might be. So just a term to be familiar with, and we'll see that throughout the lecture. All right, so let's get into this idea of paying off a loan, but only paying off part of it. And so we'll call this a partial payment. So basically, let's say you take out a $5,000 loan, and you have to pay it back. The date of maturity is a year from now. Well, after 6 months, maybe you want to pay off part of it. Maybe you want to pay off $3,000 of that loan because you have it and you can afford to pay off part of it before it's all due. And so the question is, how do we actually apply that payment to the loan? Because you can think about this. Over that first portion of the loan, interest will have been accruing. But once you pay off a good portion of the loan, now you don't owe as much. And so presumably, the amount of interest that would accrue for the rest of the loan would be smaller. And in fact, that's exactly what happens. And so when we answer this question of how is our payment applied to the loan, there's basically a series of steps that we go through to calculate this. And that series of steps has a name. It's called the United States rule. And the nitty gritty of this rule is just that if you make a partial payment, so if you make a payment that's not the full amount that you owe, what happens is your payment first pays off the interest that has accrued. So you might take a $5,000 loan, and maybe partway through that loan period, you've accrued $300.52 of interest. Well, your partial payment, will first pay off that $300.52, that interest that is accrued. And then once that interest has been set to zero, then the rest of your payment will pay off the principal, the actual amount that you borrowed. And we'll go through a full outline of actually what that looks like, and we'll do examples as well. But like I said, the nitty gritty is just that whenever you make a payment, it pays off interest first, and then it pays off what you actually borrowed from the bank or from whoever you borrowed from. All right, so continuing on, just some notes here. The United States rule is typically only used for loans that you're supposed to pay off in one lump sum. So things like student loans or a car loan or something like that, or even a mortgage on a house, those are loans that you're typically paying monthly on, maybe quarterly, or maybe yearly or something like that, generally monthly. But for those types of loans, that's a whole monthly payment. And we've looked at how to calculate those monthly payments before. But here, this is for a loan where they just say, hey, you're borrowing this money. Great, thank you. You got to pay us all. You got to pay all of it back on one specific date, the date of maturity. And then this is, hey, if you want to, pay it back partially, you know, before the date of maturity. You want to pay back some of it before the date of maturity? Well, you can. We just have to use this United States rule. Great. As I've said, yeah, these partial payments are they're not the same as monthly payments on a loan. So if you take a car loan out, you'll have a monthly payment on that. That is not the same as these partial payments. Those are actually a bit more complicated to deal with. We will see those later, but not quite now. So let's go ahead and actually explain this whole United States rule in sort of a mathematical sense and see what happens as we do it. So let's say that you start off, you take out a loan and it has a principal amount. So there is a certain amount that you are borrowing, and I'm going to label that P1. So this is the initial borrowed amount. So you take out a loan for $5,000 or however much, that I'm going to call P1. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to mark the day that that occurred as day one. This is the first day of the loan. And now you presumably have to pay back that loan eventually. But what we're saying with this partial payment idea is that you're going to pay a partial payment towards that loan. So you're not going to pay all of the loan, but you're going to try and pay part of it. And when you do that, that's going to subtract off part of what you owe. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mark that as day X1. And so this right here is the day of first partial payment. And right there, then we'll have to figure out how we actually sort of deal with, hey, how much do I owe now? So I've paid, I took a loan out with $5,000 or whatever initial borrowed amount P1, and I paid part of that off, but not all of it. Well, what we do is we calculate the interest that is accrued in between this time frame. So from the day that you first borrowed the money until the day of your payment, you're gonna calculate the interest that accrued. And for us, we're just going to be dealing with simple interest. You theoretically could do it with compound interest. It wouldn't be any more difficult. It'd just be a different formula that we use. But for us, we're just going to deal with simple interest here. And so you're going to calculate that interest that accrues from day one until day X1, which is basically just that time frame in between the day you took out the loan and the day that you paid off part of the loan. You made a partial payment. I'm going to call this interest I1 right there. And we know that we could calculate that with the principal amount multiplied, which is P1, because that's how much we borrowed, multiplied by the interest rate R. And then we can multiply that by what I'm going to call T1. And what I'll make a note of here is that T1 is just going to be the difference in how many days you had in this loan term so far. So at this point, day one was when we started, and day X1, maybe day X1 is like 100 days into the loan. Well, at that point then, to calculate the interest that is accrued from the beginning of the loan here until when I make my partial payment, that's T1, that is X1 number of days. And so that's how long has occurred in days. As we want to remind ourselves and remember, we actually like to have our time. Oh, something's happening there. So we want to have our time actually be in terms of years. So I'm going to say X1, which is in days typically. I'm going to divide it by 365. So again, there's going to be a lot of formulas here. Don't worry too much about just memorizing the formulas. Really more have a sense for the idea of what's actually going on here, sort of in a steps sort of sense. It's great. So we've calculated this interest. And then what we've said before with the United States rules, that our partial payment is going to pay off that interest first. And so what that means is we pay off whatever interest accrued, and then the rest of our partial payment is going to pay down the principal amount, excuse me, the principal amount, which was P1. And so let's say this. Let's say you start with a $1,000 loan, and after 50 days or however long, you've accrued $200 of interest. And so you have $1,200 that you have to pay back. You make a partial payment of $600. Well, 200 of that $600 goes into that, and then 400 of it goes into that. That's what's left over. And so now at that point, you have a new principal amount. You have basically, in effect, changed how much you owe. You've paid off all your outstanding interest, and then you've paid back part of what you originally borrowed. That gives you a new principal amount, P2, right here. And so I'll go ahead and label that the new borrowed amount. Basically, at this point, you can just pretend that you took out a loan on this day with amount P2. And that's exactly what I say here is step 6 is now, hey, you've got a new loan. This is just basically a completely different loan, but the principal amount is P2, which is smaller than P1 because you've paid off part of it. And it just starts on a different day. Instead of starting on the first day, maybe it starts on the 50th day or whatever day it was, which is just day X1. And so right here at step 6, we're just restarting right from scratch. And so you've got a loan with P2 on day X1. And guess what? Maybe you make another partial payment. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, here's the day that occurred. This is the day of my partial payment. And what we could actually write is the day of, this is actually our second partial payment, but obviously it's just basically another partial payment. And so what we're going to do is we're going to pay off the interest that accrued. But during that period, it's just from here to here. It's just from day X1 to day X2. And so we take off that interest first, and then whatever we have left over pays off the interest. Like I said, it pays off the interest first, and then it goes towards the principal, which in this case is P2. We get a new principal amount of P3. It's however much we have left over. And then basically we have a new loan, again, with principal P3, and it just starts on this extra day. And then we just repeat all of this until we just finish paying off the loan. And that's basically it right there. It's kind of just this step 7 through 11, but just repeating over and over. So it's just, hey, you borrow money, you have a principal, interest accrues on that, you make a payment, which pays off that interest first, and then it takes down the principal that you owe. It takes it down how much you actually owe. Hey, now you have a new loan with a different principal amount, and it just starts on a different day. And then you just keep doing that over and over and over and over and over. And one thing I haven't mentioned here is this little point here, that our partial payments are covering the full amount of the interest and some, and a little bit more. And so what I'll mention there is that we could theoretically make a partial payment that is actually less than the interest that has accrued. And I have a whole nother thing here. This is basically the same exact thing that I just switched over from, but all that it says is that if our partial payment does not amount to the interest that has accrued so far, that partial payment, it just pays off part of the interest, and then it doesn't pay off any of the principal because we haven't paid enough, right? We have to take down that interest first. And if our partial payment doesn't get rid of the interest, then basically we just have a new loan with the old principal, but it's just now it has the interest that I couldn't pay off back in this step of making that partial payment. We're not really going to deal with this scenario that much. I think it's important to understand that if your partial payment doesn't cover the interest, then you just didn't really do anything. I mean, you didn't lower the principal amount of your loan. You just paid off some interest. The reason that we're not really going to focus on this very much is that what we'll find is that the amount of interest that accrues in the types of loans that we're looking at is not very much. And it would be kind of foolish to make a partial payment that doesn't cover the interest. For example, we'll see an example in a second where we take out a $6,000 loan and the amount of interest that accrues is about $65. And so if you're taking out a $6,000 loan, you're likely not going to bother with a partial payment of less than $65. Presumably, if you're borrowing $6,000 from someone, you better be able to pay a lot more back. So your partial payments are probably going to be more than that $65 of interest. We'll get into all that and we'll see why that's sort of foolish to make a partial payment that doesn't cover your interest. And I'll try to call back to that in a little bit. But let's go ahead and let's look at an example here. I know that all of this that I've marked up it can seem daunting. So let's just sort of slowly step through an example. And then basically you'll take that example and you'll just copy it as you're doing more and more problems. And hopefully you'll just do enough problems that you'll get this ingrained into your head of how this sort of cycle works, how this repetition works here. So let's say that Sarah takes out a loan for $6,000. And so I'll mark that here as my principal P. And there is an interest rate of 4.5%. And again, as we've stated, that 4.5% is assumed to be per year. If I don't say 4.5% per day or per month, we just assume that it's per year. We'll note simple interest right there. Make sure I get that fully there. So it's simple interest. And the date, the time of our loan is going to be 130 days. I'm not going to give that a variable, but I'll just underline it just to call out to it there. Just something important to note. We have a 130-day loan. She makes a payment of $2,500. So this is a partial payment right there. And I'm not going to bother giving that a letter. Let's just underline it that that's important. And then she makes that payment after 30 days. And again, I'm not going to assign that anything yet, but we'll end up using it. I want to know how much Sarah owes on the date of maturity, which is that 130 days later. So let's go ahead and work this out. And I'm going to try and not focus too much on formulas. I'm going to try and focus more on thinking about this in a situational sense and sort of try and deduce, hey, what do we have to do next, right? What comes next here, rather than just thinking about formulas that we can plug and chug with. In the second part of this lecture, I'll give us a little bit more formulas that we can sort of just plug and chug into. But for now, I want to focus on sort of thinking it through and thinking about what makes sense. So as you could presume, normally we would just calculate the interest on her 6,000, add that to the principal, and then just say, hey, that's the future value, right? That's just how much you have to pay back. You borrowed $6,000, but then there's a bunch of interest that gets added onto that. And so you got to pay that back. But instead of paying it all back after 130 days, which is that date of maturity, she pays back part of it after 30 days. So that complicates things. And so let's actually go ahead and do this. Let's go ahead and look at the first section of this loan. And so let's actually do this. Let me give myself a new page here, a blank page. And I actually want to sort of have a timeline here. So we're going to start right here. And we're going to end right there. And so this time frame is sort of a timeline on number of days. So we have the first day where we took out $6,000. Let's go ahead and do this. $6,000 borrowed. and we have our interest rate and all that stuff. We have all that info. I don't need to clutter up this page with that. After 30 days, I don't know, maybe right there. After 30 days, she pays off $2,500. Let's actually do this. This won't be to scale, but I'm just going to put the 30 days right in the middle here. Obviously not to scale, but it'll give me some more space. So what we have here is we have her paying off $2,500. Here, I'll put that in green. But during this time frame, between day 1 and day 30, interest accrues. And so let's go ahead and mark that with a different color. Interest accrues. I'll move this over a little bit. So interest accrues during that time frame between day 1 and day 30. So the very first thing that I need to do is I need to add the interest onto this $6,000. I got to calculate the interest that accrues and then add it to that $6,000. So let's go ahead and do this. So we've got our $6,000 principal. We have a 4.5% annual interest rate. Our full term is 130 days, but really the first section that we're looking at is 30 days, right? That's on this timeline here. We just have this 30-day section that I care about. And so what I can do is I can calculate the interest during that 30 days. And it's simple interest. We stated that in the problem. And so I can say that my interest I1 is going to be equal to P1, which is our principal amount of 6,000. That's how much was borrowed, multiplied by the interest rate written as a decimal, 0.045. And then we have to, we're just calculating the interest for this first 30 days. And so we would just say there that the time is 30 days divided by 365 days in a year. So that's one thing that I'll mention here. This time is in years. And that's important. We always want that time the units of that time to match the units of our interest rate, which, as we said, were in years. If you multiply this out, you'll get $22.19. I am rounding there. Don't worry too much if you're off by a cent or two. That's okay. So we won't worry too much about rounding here. But we got $22.19. So that's the interest that accrued in this time frame. So I'm going to just sneak that right in here. $22.19 equals interest accrued. Space this out a little bit, make that look good. All right, so $22.19 of interest accrued. And so now on this day 30, I owe $6,022.19. In that pink, I've got how much I owe on that day, right? And so then we make, and we can see here that I've calculated that my future value is just the principal amount plus the interest, 6,000 plus that 2219. So that's the amount that I owe on day 30. 30 days into this loan, they're going to say, hey, thank you. You've borrowed $6,000. Now pay us back $6,022.19. And so you're going to say, great, that's how much I owe you. Don't have all of it, but I do have $2,500 that I can pay you. And they say, all right, great, we'll take it. So on this 30th day, she pays the bank $2,500. So she takes the amount that she owed and she subtracts off $2,500, and that gives her this amount just above $3,500. This amount here is how much she owes now at this point, sort of at the end of day 30, if you will. Let's go ahead and do this. Let's put this way up here. Let's say, let's box this and say start of day 30. And then we'll put in another box here. That's the end of day 30. And that amount at the end of day 30, as we've calculated before, it's just this amount that I owed in the beginning, but then we paid off. Here, let's go ahead and do this. Yeah, well, we paid off this 2,500. And so now the amount that I owe is that 35.22 and 19 cents. It's just the difference between this and this. It's just that 6,022 minus the amount that you pay. You're basically saying, hey, I'm trying to pay all of it off, but I can't. Here's $2,500. And then they say, all right, that's fine. This is how much you owe. And so now at this point, this is exactly what I'm getting at here, where you can basically pretend like we have a completely new loan. You can just forget about all of this. Forget about everything from this day over. We just don't care. I don't care about it at all. Now, starting on day 30, I have a new loan that has an amount of this 35.22 right there, starting on day 30. So what we'll notice is we can just do the same exact calculations here. During this time period here, this is 100 days. So that's probably easy to see here, just, hey, 30 days to 130 days is 100 days. In certain cases, you might need to actually do that math of 130 minus 30. I'll go ahead and write that in here just so we can see it. Equals 100 days. So now I have a loan that's 100 days long, and the new principal amount is this 35.22. So we can state all that nice and cleanly right down here. Sarah has a new loan of 35.22 and 19 cents. Same interest rate, that hasn't changed. And that new time, which I'm going to call T2, is that 100 days. So we had that T1 right here of 30 days, and now we've got T2 of 100 days right there. So we've got basically just a new loan, and guess what we're going to do? We're going to calculate the interest that accrues on that loan. And like I did last time, I'll go ahead and start to mark that in here. We have some amount of interest accrued, and we'll calculate that. And how we calculate that is just say, hey, how much did you borrow, or how much did you owe at the end of day 30, right? And how long was that time period for, and what was your interest rate? Well, we take all of that and we plug it into our nice simple interest formula. We have the amount that was owed, we have the interest rate, and we have the time in years. Yet again, I'll mention time in years right there. And it's 100 days divided by 365 days to give me years. That gives me $43.42 of interest. A good check here is to recognize that that interest is more than what it was in the first scenario. Granted, we have less that was owed in this on this loan period, but the time is a lot longer than the first 30 days. Now we have 100 days, and so I would expect that interest to be a bit larger. And so that interest amount was $43.42. So what we do is we say, hey, you owed, well, now we're on the date of maturity. You owed, or you borrowed $35.22 and 19 cents, and then this amount of interest was added to that. So what we need to do is we have to actually add that in. And if we do that, we're going to have our future value, which is the amount that was borrowed, $35.22, add the interest to that, and we get $35.65 and 61 cents. So we'll pop back here. We can write that in. We'll put it in pink because that's our color that we've been using for how much is owed. And right there, we actually have our answer. the question was how much is owed on the date of maturity, and that date of maturity is just the end here. That's the day 130. How much is owed, and that's how much is owed on that day of 130. So just in recap, what we've done is we've started off with, hey, Sarah borrowed $6,000. After 30 days, we had an interest that accrued of $22.19. So we added that in to get the $6,022.19. This is how much is owed at the start of day 30. Then she pays $2,500 towards it, taking it down to $3,522.19. Now, over the next 100 days, $43 of interest adds on to this amount that she owed. So now we add that to it, we have the final amount here, and that's our answer. That's how much is owed on the date of maturity. So there's one other thing that's sort of interesting to look at, another question to ask after we figured out, hey, here's how much she owed on the date of maturity. What I want to know is how much interest did she save by actually doing this, by actually making this partial payment, right? She made a partial payment because if she does that, it lowers her principal amount, which in effect lowers the interest that accrues. And so, you know, she didn't just do this for no reason. She did it because it actually lowers the interest payment. It lowers the interest that accrues, and we can actually calculate that. So what I'm first going to do is I'm first going to calculate how much interest she actually paid. How much interest did she pay in this scenario of making the partial payment? And this should be very easy to calculate. If we look right back here, we've written down the interest that accrued. So this is the amount of interest that she paid. I just add those numbers together, the 22.19 and the 43.42. And so if we do that, if we add that 23.19 and the 43.42, we're going to get 65.62. And again, I'm doing some rounding here. In my math, I kept all of the decimals in each of these. And so that sort of affected this final answer. Again, don't worry if you're off by a cent or two, that's fine. I'm not going to be nitpicky about that. But we've got this interest that accrues right here, $65.62. And that's how much interest she paid. In reality, let's say. So in reality, she made a partial payment, and so her interest was sort of split up into these two sections, and that's how much interest she paid. So now let's calculate how much interest she would have paid if she didn't bother with this partial payment. And now let's think critically here, and let's go back. If she didn't do any of this, if she didn't, deal with any of this day 30 stuff and paying off $2,500, she would have had a $6,000 loan at 4.5%, which is our interest rate, over 130 days. The time frame would just have been 130 days if she didn't bother with any partial payments. She would have moved on. 130 days later, she would have just paid off what she owed, which would have been the $6,000 plus the interest that was accrued. And so that interest that would have accrued if she, in this sort of hypothetical scenario, it's really easy to calculate. It's just the simple interest formula with a principal of 6,000 and a time of 130 days. That's just the full time of this loan. And so if she hadn't made that partial payment, her loan would have been for 130 days, which we've put into years. Again, I'll mention it. Time in years. Really want to emphasize that. And her amount that she borrowed was $6,000. So we multiply this out, we get $96.16. So now I have the amount of interest that she would have paid if she didn't do a partial payment. And I have the amount of interest that she actually paid because she did a partial payment. And so what we can do is we could just take the difference of them. And again, doing some weird rounding. Again, don't worry if you're off by a cent or two, that's fine. We get $30.55. And that's how much she saved, right? This is how much she would have paid in interest, and this is how much she actually paid in interest. So she saved about $30 by doing this partial payment. Now, that'll be it. That's actually everything that I'm gonna ask us in this example. We're done. We finished the problem, but I want to mention one thing. To me, saving $30 does not seem worth paying off part of this, but paying off part of the loan early. Obviously, some people may disagree with me, and that's okay. But when I look at this, I say, actually, let's go back here. So she takes out a loan for $6,000. Presumably, she needs that money for something. I don't know. Maybe it's starting a restaurant or something like that. And after 30 days, she's paying back almost half of what she owes. And by doing that, she saves about $30. What I'm thinking about, the reason why I say I don't really think it's worth it is because in a lot of scenarios, if you're borrowing this money, let's use that example of starting a restaurant, coming up with this amount of money after 30 days into your 130-day loan, that's typically tough to do. If you don't have $6,000 and so you're borrowing it, it's going to be tough to come up with $2,500 so quickly. And so to me, I would just wait until the end of the 130 days and pay all of it back, because I'm only saving $30 of interest by making this large partial payment. That being said, obviously money is money. $30 is $30. I mean, even if you are borrowing $6,000, I mean, sure, $30 is very small relative to the amount that you're borrowing, but it's still money. And so, like I said, other people might disagree with me, and obviously it depends on the scenario. Maybe you just have an extra $2,500 that you can make a payment with, and so you figure, hey, why not? I don't need this $2,500. I can pay back part of my loan. I'll save $30. Great. Go out for a nice dinner or something. So yeah, that's sort of my subjective take, if you will, on whether or not you should do this partial payment. But that's just my take on it. Obviously, other people will have different viewpoints there. That's totally fine. That's not even really something that I'd ask you, like, hey, is this worth it? That's just my take on it, on sort of looking at the math of this and wondering, would I do this if I was in this scenario? If I was Sarah, would I do this? But yeah, so that's actually going to be it. We finished our example, and we've seen sort of how these partial payments just subtract off the interest first, and then they take down the principal, and then you just have a new loan, and then you just redo all of it again and again and again and again and again. And so I'll go ahead and call that the end of the lecture and leave you with that.